Hey everybody! Alright, this is our revision video about the body systems topic. So I'm going to talk about all the different concepts in body systems. I'll get into as much detail as I can in about half an hour. Alright, so the first main concept in body systems is the idea that our bodies are organized into systems, but then each system is organized into different layers below that. So here's a picture of the circulatory system. And within the system, within the circulatory system, it's made of organs, like the heart. And then organs, they're made up of lots of different tissues all joined together. For example, some muscle tissue that you can see here. And then if you zoom into tissues even further, you'll need a microscope for that, then you get to cells. So all of our bodies and every living thing is made of these 4 different levels of organization. Systems all the way down to cells. And so that brings us to the 2 main body systems that we're focusing on for our topic this term. And both of these systems are to do with our cells getting energy so that they can power our body. Okay, well the first one is the respiratory system. As we know, the respiratory system is all about breathing because we need to bring oxygen in and we need to take carbon dioxide out of our body. So we call that gas exchange for short. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And so whenever we're breathing, we're taking in that oxygen. It goes through the respiratory system, and then we're taking out carbon dioxide whenever we breathe out. So that's for getting oxygen into our body. Well, the other thing that our cells need is energy. And so as humans, we need to get our energy by eating foods, and that's the job of the digestive system. So its job is to break down our foods and absorb them so they can get into our body. And then our cells can use that energy. Breaks down and absorbs our food. Alright. Well, on the theme of the digestive system, there are 3 main ways that animals can eat, and 3 different types of foods. So these are herbivores. Remember, herbivores are animals that only eat plants or plant material. There's omnivores, which are us. As humans, we have evolved to eat plant material and meat. Some people can choose to be vegetarians, but we still count as being an omnivore because our bodies have evolved to eat both. And then we get to carnivores. They only eat meat. Lots of our favourite pets are carnivores. Dogs, cats, all the big cats as well, and things like seals. Lots of animals are carnivores. And going back to herbivores, most of our farm animals that we tend to eat, they're herbivores. So cows, sheep, goats, and then lots of other famous animals, kangaroos in Australia, and lots of African animals that live out on the plains, like giraffes and zebras as well. Well, how do those animals actually eat their food? Well, that's all about the kinds of teeth and the shape of their teeth. So remember, there are 4 types of teeth, and remember, every animal has all 4. Well, we're talking about vertebrate animals, so every animal with bones has all 4 teeth. But the difference is what size are they and how they use them. So all 4 in each animal. And remember, there are incisors, which are the flat ones, the flat teeth at the front of your mouth. They're used for slicing and biting. The canines are the pointy ones. They're used for grabbing onto your prey, particularly for carnivores. Pardon me. Okay, back to it. Canines are for grabbing, a little bit of tearing off meat as well. But then the molars and the premolars, they're for mainly chewing and tearing as well. Chewing and tearing. Okay. And let's have a look at the differences. So in carnivores, they need to do a lot of biting to catch their prey, and they need to grab a prey if they're catching and hunting a live animal. So carnivores are going to have pretty pointy incisors and really pointy canines at the front. And then they're still going to have molars and premolars, but they're also pointy to help them to grab onto prey and to tear any meat as they chew up whatever animal they're eating. Delicious. So the main thing to look for is all the teeth in carnivores are pointy and sharp. Now if we look at herbivores, they've still got incisors and they've still got some small canines, but they're pretty flat, so they're just used for grabbing onto grass and leaves, not for actually biting into meat. And then they've got a really big row of molars and premolars that tend to be flat, and they're used for grinding and crushing up whatever plant material that animal eats. Then we get to omnivores. Here's a human skull. We have a balance sort of in between of herbivores and carnivores. So we have molars and premolars at the back. They're used for biting and for tearing and chewing. And we have average-sized incisors and average-sized canines. So that it can, because we're well adapted, we can be flexible in what we eat, so our mouth is designed to eat a whole range of different foods, meats, and vegetables and plants. Okay, the next thing you need to know is all the parts of the digestive system. So these are the organs in the digestive system. Remember, systems are made of organs. So it's really a whole lot of memory here. When we eat food, firstly, food goes into our mouth, then it passes down the tube to our stomach, and that tube is called the esophagus. Then the food gets to our stomach, which is where digestion starts to happen and the food starts to get broken down. Then the food passes to the small intestine, which is where it starts to be absorbed into the bloodstream. And that's where all the absorption happens, actually, because by the time it gets to the large intestine, which is next, no more food gets absorbed, and there's only waste food left over. And then all that waste food goes out the rectum, out the anus, into the toilet, and off to the sewage farm. We don't need it anymore. So that's the path that food takes. There are also those 3 organs that we call the accessory organs, or the accessory digestive organs. So food doesn't travel through them, but they're still really important in the digestive system. They've still got an important job to do. And you can see here we've got the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And each of these organs, its main job is to make some chemicals to help digestion. So they make digestive enzymes, which are just chemicals to break the food down. And the liver, it makes, as well as making enzymes, it makes bile. We'll talk about bile later on. And then the gallbladder stores the bile ready to send into the stomach. It's basically just a little storage container. Okay, let's get into some more detail about how digestion works now. So there are 2 main ways that our food gets broken down in the digestive system. There's physical digestion, which is crushing, grinding up our food into tiny little pieces, which makes it easier to pass through. And then there's chemical digestion, which is getting into even more detail and breaking apart molecules. So let's look at how each of these works briefly now. Physical digestion. Like I said, it's crushing, it's grinding, it's breaking things into smaller pieces. As you know, you need to chew up your food before you can swallow it, so that's one of the benefits. And that's the first type of physical digestion. Chewing breaks the food into smaller bits so that we can swallow it, and it makes it easier for the molecules to be broken apart later on. We also have a process called peristalsis, you can see here, which is basically crushing and squeezing the food as it gets passed down our esophagus and into our stomach. Because our esophagus is a muscle, and our stomach actually has muscles in it too. And so it's constantly compressing, pushing, crushing all that food into smaller pieces. Then we have dissolving. So that might seem obvious, but some foods, particularly fats, they can't dissolve in water. So what we have in our digestive system is a chemical called bile. Remember, bile is made in the liver and then is stored in the gallbladder. So bile comes along, it comes along to the fats, and the fats aren't dissolved. So you can imagine them looking like this, like salad dressing before you shake it up. But then when the bile comes in, it dissolves the fats, mixes them all together, and so it's a lot easier for our enzymes to break down those fats later on. So bile dissolves fats, that's the key. Alright, so all those physical processes, they're really useful, but the main process of digestion is chemical, which happens later on. So we've broken up our food into small pieces. Now what comes along are enzymes. We call them digestive enzymes. The job of a digestive enzyme is to come along and break apart a molecule of food. So you can see here this purple one gets broken apart, this one gets broken into smaller molecules or atoms, and so does this one here. So digestive enzymes break apart molecules. Molecules of our food. And once they're broken apart, then they can be absorbed. So that's the final stage of digestion. After digestion, those tiny food molecules that have been broken apart, they get absorbed by the small intestine. Okay. Some of the above standard concepts are actually knowing the enzymes and where they're made and where they work. So let's briefly talk about that. Firstly, there are three categories of food. There are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You might have heard of those when you talk about nutrition in health class, and they're often in the media too. So carbohydrates, we know, are sugars, breads, grains, and things. They've got lots of carbs in. And to break down carbohydrates, we have amylase, which is an enzyme in our saliva. And we have lactase, which comes along later in the small intestine. Small intestine. So these enzymes only work on carbohydrates. They break up a carbohydrate into some simple molecules called glucose, which you might have heard before. It's just simple sugars. The second group are proteins, and so to break proteins down, we have two types of enzymes called pepsins and trypsins. Pepsins are in the stomach, So they get made in the liver and the pancreas, and they get sent into the stomach, and they break down all our proteins into amino acids, smaller molecules that we can absorb. And their trypsins are in the small intestine as well. The last category of foods are fats. So remember, we need bile first because that helps us to dissolve the fats. It doesn't break them down, but it helps the enzymes to get in there. And then once we've dissolved the fats, lipase comes along. Here it is. Lipase is the enzyme. It's in the stomach and the small intestine. Well, there are lots of different types. It comes along, it breaks apart all those fats into smaller chemicals and smaller molecules. Okay, that's all the main detail about how digestion works. The final thing in the digestive system is to compare how other digestive systems differ in different animals. So let's compare. Remember, we've got carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores. So we'll start with carnivores down here. Remember that carnivores eat meat, and meat is really easy to break apart. So it doesn't need much physical digestion or chemical digestion to get the molecules out of some meat, because it's pretty soft and it's easy to chew. So carnivores, because of that, they've got a short digestive system. So they have the shortest small intestine of any animal, you can see here, because the meat will break down pretty quickly in the stomach. It also breaks down quickly in the small intestine, and then it's really easy to absorb into the body. And then moving up to omnivores, well, as omnivores, we eat meat and plants. Meat's pretty easy to absorb. Plants are a little bit harder, so we need a slightly longer small intestine so that we can break apart the leaves and the plants and the vegetables that we're eating. So our small intestine is a medium length to help break down the plant material. Okay. And then lastly, we get to herbivores. So what's actually happened with herbivore animals is they've evolved two different ways of digesting their plant matter. So remember, plant matter is really hard to digest. That's the key. Plants are hard to digest. They're tough. They've got lots of fibers and stringy bits in there. It's hard for our digestive systems to break them down. So the first method that some herbivores use is called being a foregut fermenter, or a ruminant. So these animals have a rumen, which just means a really, really large stomach that's broken into small chambers. And in those chambers, we have a whole lot of bacteria living in there. So those bacteria, when the plant matter goes into the stomach, the bacteria start to break down all the grass and the leaves and the plant matter, which helps it to be digested for that animal. So then, once it moves from the rumen, it goes through all four chambers, then into the small intestine, and these animals have the longest small intestine of all the animals. So they're quite good at digesting. They have a long intestine, but they can break down all the grass and things they need to. Then we come across to the hindgut fermenters, which means they have bacteria living behind the small intestine. So you can see we've got the stomach, then we've got the small intestine, and then the bacteria are living in this part here, which is called the cecum. So the bacteria live in there, which means when the food reaches the cecum, they can start to break it down. But the problem with that is, they're breaking the food down, but the food has already passed through the small intestine. And the small intestine is where most of the absorption happens. So this type of digestion is really inefficient. because they can't really absorb much of that plant matter. Even though the bacteria can break some of it down, they can only really absorb it in the cecum itself. So what these animals do sometimes is they come along and eat their own droppings, which are partly digested, and then it passes again through the stomach and the small intestine, and then they can start to absorb the nutrients from that half-digested food. So they do the delicious process of eating their own feces. Alright, that's the digestive system done in lots of detail. Let's move on to the respiratory system. Okay, the respiratory system. So of course we need to remember that for the respiratory system, its job is to get that oxygen into our body. Remember, we call it gas exchange, but what it's really doing is it's bringing in oxygen, and we use O2 for short, because that's the molecule, that's the chemical formula for oxygen. Its job is bringing in oxygen, that's the main thing. It also removes carbon dioxide, which is a waste product. So carbon dioxide goes out, but that main thing is oxygen needs to come in. And the reason that is because our cells need food and they need oxygen, and those two inputs is what is used for something called cellular respiration. We'll talk about it later in more detail, but all our cells need to do cellular respiration because that's how they get their energy. They take food and they take oxygen. They use those to get energy for the cells to function. Okay, so how does the respiratory system work? Well, you need to know all these different parts. Let's talk about them in order from where the air goes when we breathe in and breathe out. So breathing is just the process of air going in and out of our respiratory system. Respiration is different. That's the actual process of the cells breaking down food and using oxygen. Breathing is different to respiration. Okay, so when we take a breath, air obviously goes in through our mouth and our nose. We've all taken millions of breaths in our life. We know how that works. Then the air goes past the back of our throat, which is called the pharynx. That's just the name for our throat. Then it passes... Sorry, let's write some numbers. So the nose and the mouth is where it goes through first. Then the air goes past the pharynx. Then the air gets to the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is this amazing little trapdoor that opens up the windpipe when we need to let air in. And if we're swallowing, the trapdoor flips across, and then it only lets food go down our esophagus. So the epiglottis controls the direction of the air or the food. It's like the traffic lights of our throat. So the air goes past the epiglottis. Hopefully it does go down our windpipe. And that is the trachea. That's just another name for the windpipe. Then it keeps going down, and then the windpipe splits. The trachea splits into two smaller windpipes, and they're called bronchi. Or bronchus is the singular. So one bronchus, so two bronchi. Then you get into the lungs themselves. So that's number 6. And then when the air is in the lungs, the bronchi start to branch off, you can see, like a tree, and those smaller branches are called bronchioles. Tiny little bronchi. And then when we get to the very end of the bronchioles end at a little air sac that looks a bit like a broccoli or a cauliflower, and that's called the alveoli. Well, these are called the alveoli. So that's the end of where the air gets to. You can see the alveoli here. So the air
comes into the alveoli, it sits there, and the oxygen comes out of the air and then goes into the bloodstream from there. So that's the most important part. This is how the oxygen actually gets into our body. It goes into tiny blood vessels called capillaries, which are part of our circulatory system. So the oxygen is entering our bloodstream there. Alright. Well, that's all fine, but how does the air actually get in? It can't just travel on its own. We actually need something to cause all that air to be sucked into our body. And that's the job of the diaphragm here. So the diaphragm's a muscle, and it pulls down on our lungs, and it expands our lungs and causes air to be sucked in. So that's how we actually breathe. Okay. So we've got to the stage where air has entered the bloodstream. But what does the oxygen and the carbon dioxide do, and how does it get to the cells? Well, that's actually the job of the circulatory system. So you can't really talk about the respiratory system without talking about the circulatory system too. So here it is. It's made up of the heart, the arteries which are red, and the veins which are blue. So what happens is once the oxygen has reached our lungs, and oxygen we draw as red because blood cells that carry oxygen, they're nice and bright red. So remember, the oxygen comes into our body at the lungs, in the alveoli, and then it enters the bloodstream. And once it's in the bloodstream, it gets pumped by the heart all the way around the body. You can see all these arrows. The oxygen gets pumped down our arms, down our legs, up to our brain, which is really important, and to all our other organs. And here is what's actually happening when the oxygen reaches the cells. So you can see here, this black line is what we call a capillary, which is just part of the bloodstream. It's a tiny blood vessel. So the capillaries come up right up next to the cells. And then because they're carrying oxygen, the oxygen just drops off. It leaves the capillary in the blood and it goes into the cells. And the cells use that to do that amazing process they need to get their energy, which is called cellular respiration. So they use the O2 plus the food molecules that they've got from digestion to do respiration. And then one of the waste products that gets made from cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide follows the exact path that oxygen does, but in reverse. So it goes from the cells back out to the bloodstream. Then it goes back from the bloodstream all the way back into the lungs. So it goes in reverse, back from wherever it was to the lungs, and then back through the alveoli, through the bronchioles, through the bronchi, up the trachea, and out our mouth or our nose. And into the air, because we don't need carbon dioxide, it's just a waste product. Alright, so that's how the circulatory system is really important for our respiratory system. You can see that lots of body systems end up working together. Systems are separate, but they also work together at the same time. Alright, I've mentioned cellular respiration a few times now. Here is the whole process of what is going on in our cells for them to get energy. If cellular respiration didn't happen, our cells couldn't survive. They'd have no energy, they wouldn't be able to do anything, and life couldn't exist, really. This is one of the most important processes that ever evolved in living things. So remember, it's how cells get their energy. So I've mentioned it before, the two things that cells need is they need food molecules. And the job of, the body system whose job that is the digestive system. It breaks down and absorbs them into our blood. And then we also need oxygen, like we talked about before. And that's the job of the respiratory system, to bring that oxygen in, take it to our bloodstream and deliver it. Okay. And so, obviously, this process releases energy. That's what's shown here. Lots and lots of energy gets released for the cells. They can go and do their thing and help our bodies to survive. And then we have two waste products as well. So this is what gets released from cellular respiration. I've already mentioned carbon dioxide. That's one of the waste products. But actually water gets made as well, which is pretty handy because we can make our own water as we're doing respiration in our cells. Okay. So that's covering the main human body systems. We're learning digestive and we're learning respiratory. We do have this small topic as well added on, which is all about how plants reproduce. Because it's always important to focus on plants as well. Plants are still organisms and they still have their own types of body systems. They work pretty differently to animals, but it's fascinating to see how plants work when you compare them to the body systems that we have. So I'm going to start off by talking about the two different ways that species can reproduce. And this is true for every animal and for every plant, and for fungi and other things too. So there are two different ways species can reproduce. Firstly, you can have asexual reproduction. Humans definitely don't do asexual reproduction. And then we have sexual reproduction, which is what humans use, of course. Why does anything need to reproduce? Well, if you can't have children, you can't continue your species, and eventually your species will die out. So every single species that's ever existed has to reproduce, and it uses one of these two methods. Sometimes both of them, though, actually. So asexual reproduction basically is just cloning. So the individual copies itself. It might have babies or it might grow stalks like these plants here, and those stalks or babies are exact clones of the adult itself. That would be completely weird if we did that as people. I can't imagine having a baby that is identical to you. That would be really strange. Or if children were identical to one of their parents. So asexual reproduction is cloning. Sexual reproduction is where children are a combination of their two parents. And we'll talk more about that in detail in a second. And of course, sexual reproduction involves mating as well. Children are a combination of their parents. Okay, so let's focus on asexual reproduction for now. This is pretty common in plants. So you can see a few examples of it here. We've got this plant up here, which is growing tiny little, what they're called is plantlets on the edge of its leaf. So these little plantlets, all they do is they grow on the edge of the leaf, then they fall off onto the ground. Maybe they get blown in the wind a little bit, and they'll just grow into a brand new plant that's a clone of its parent that was growing on. So that's pretty helpful. Plants can reproduce really quickly using plantlets. You can also have stems that run along the ground or that run underground. And what the plant does is it just grows these stems. The stem comes up and it grows a brand new plant a little bit further along from the original parent plant. These are called stolons or rhizomes. We don't really need to know those details for now. And as humans, we've actually invented another way that plants can reproduce asexually, and that's by taking cuttings, which this person's done here. So you cut off a bit of the plant, you just stick the bottom of that stem into the soil. Sometimes you need to add some hormones to get it working. But then the bottom of that stalk will actually start to grow some roots on it, and eventually you can plant it into the ground, and you've got a free plant that's a complete clone of the parent plant. So this is how horticulture and gardeners often make brand new plants, because it's free. You don't have to buy anything new, you just make cuttings and make a whole lot more new plants. The last method of asexual reproduction is these little things called spores. And you can see them on the bottom of this fern here. Ferns are one of the species that uses spores to reproduce. And all they are is they're tiny little single cells. Again, they're an exact copy of their parent. And those single cells fly through the air. Maybe they get carried through the water. And then they just land in the soil. And eventually they grow into a brand new plant that was a copy of their parent. So those are methods of asexual reproduction. Let's look at how sexual reproduction works. Again, because the main way it works is by this process called fertilization. So in fertilization, it's probably something you're familiar with. It happens in humans, it happens in most animals as well. You need two different cells and they come together and they merge to create a new organism. So you need a female cell, and in humans these are called eggs, which we know. They're produced in the ovaries of women. And then the male reproductive cells are called sperm cells. Obviously they're made in the testes of men. And they're the cell that combines with the egg during fertilization. Another key word that sometimes comes up is what we call these two reproductive cells, and we call sperm and egg gametes for short, which just means reproductive cells. So fertilization is when a sperm comes along. Sperm can swim because they have this little tail. They come along to the egg. The sperm and the egg fuse together, and that grows into a new organism. So the sperm and egg fuse together, grows a new organism, and the organism has half of the genes from both of their parents. So they're a combination of mum and dad, just like we are as people. Okay, the last thing to learn is how do plants do sexual reproduction. We've learned quite a few different ways for how plants can reproduce asexually. But many groups of plants have evolved sexual reproduction, and in particular all the plants with flowers. That is the point of a flower. How do plants reproduce using sexual reproduction? The short answer is flowers, like I said. The whole point of a flower is for a plant to fertilize another plant and then grow some baby plants, which we call seedlings. So the key process for plants when they reproduce sexually is this process here called pollination. Essentially, pollination is just when pollen which contain the sperm cells. It gets carried from one flower, which you can see here, carried across to another flower. It's a simple process. Okay, pollen gets carried from one flower to another, and the key is it's always carried by something called a pollinator. And these can be animals. Lots of insects like bees are good pollinators because they carry pollen. But also the wind can be a pollinator too. It just blows the pollen from one flower and it lands across on another flower of a different plant, and that allows fertilization to happen. So let's look at the details now about all the parts of a flower so we can learn more about how pollination happens. Okay, let's focus on the key parts, like where is the male and the female, where are the male and female cells found? So at the top of these little structures up here, this is where you find the pollen grains. So this is called the anther. It contains pollen. And right down here in this structure here called the ovary, that contains the egg. Just like ovaries in humans contain the egg cells too. So in this flower there's just one egg, but some flowers have lots and lots of eggs all in the same ovary. Sometimes you might hear an egg called an ovule in plants. So that's the more scientific name. So that's where the two different types of gametes are found. You've got pollen up here, you've got the ovule or the egg down here. The other parts of the flower you need to know. Holding up the anther is this little stalk here, which is called the filament. And the anther and the filament together, they make up the male part of the flower, and we call that the stamen. So that's the symbol for male. Stamens are the male part because they carry the pollen. And the ovary is part of the female part, which also includes this stalk, which is called the style. And this part at the top here where the pollen lands, which is called the stigma. So the stigma, the style, and the ovary, and the ovules, they're all part of the female part of the flower. So that's the part, that's the sign for female. And the female part of the flower is the carpel. So they're the most important parts for carrying the sperm and the eggs. Then we have a few other parts of flowers. We have the petals, which are the nice coloured parts that we all like to look at. That gives flowers their great colour and appeal. Under the petals, we've got these little green, smaller petal-like things. They're called the sepals. Then we have the stalk of the flower that holds everything up. Okay. You might have heard of nectar as well. Often nectar is held at right at the bottom of the ovary. That's a bit hard to see. But in this area down here, sometimes there's a little container that holds nectar. Nectar's just there to attract a pollinator to come along. Because bees and insects and birds and things, they love to eat nectar because it's really sugary. It's just like us having a can of soft drink. So they come along, they love to eat or drink the nectar. But as they do that, the pollinator is going to come along and it's going to brush onto the anthers, and lots of pollen is going to collect on that pollinator. So when our little bee here comes along, here's our little bee. When our bee comes along, it's really just coming along for a nice drink of sweet nectar. It loves to drink some nectar, but it's going to brush across on all these anthers and it's going to collect some pollen. And then when it comes across to another flower, it's going to accidentally brush on the stigma, and then all those pollen grains are going to be dropped off on top of the stigma, and now it's fertilized the flower. And then the pollen grains contain the sperm cells, and the sperm cells basically swim down the style into the ovule, and they fertilize the ovule, and now we have fertilization happened. So this ovule doesn't grow into a baby like in humans and animals. When fertilization has happened, it grows into a seed. And seeds are amazing because they don't grow straight away. They can survive for years or more until the conditions are perfect, and then that seed will grow into a new plant. So when fertilization has occurred, it grows into a seed. The egg or ovule grows into a seed. And then that seed grows into a new plant eventually. Okay, so that's all the details for how plants reproduce. Remember, if plants didn't have flowers, or if plants couldn't reproduce, we wouldn't have any food supplies, we wouldn't be able to grow any foods, and we just wouldn't have flowers around as part of our human culture, which has been really important. Okay, that is all of our topic. There's lots to remember with all these body systems, so make sure you do plenty of practice for your revision. Okay, good luck.